Hi, it's Craig and Richard here again for the weekly debrief. So we hope you're still getting a lot out of the course. We've certainly been getting a lot of really interesting, often funny, sort of comments and reflections, but also some excellent questions too, and we'll try and address a few of these. One thing that has come up in the conversation is about different kinds of stress response. Fight or flight, tend and befriend, of course, is another one, but the freeze response. Richard, would you like to say a little bit about the freeze response?
Definitely, yeah. We focused a lot on the fight and flight response, in some of the content that we provided. But of course, at times we freeze up. I mean, animals under stress, or a rabbit might see an eagle and just freeze up, or faint and play dead. And actually, that can be quite an adaptive response sometimes to just to play dead and hope that you don't get noticed.
Yeah. So it's sort of like a protective mechanism, and that's actually a shutting down response.
Yes.
There's another kind of freeze response, which is like a seizing up. It's like something happens and the amygdala hijacks and we're just totally confused about what to do and we're unable to respond. And that's quite a different freeze response.
Which is less adaptive, I think.
That's actually a stress response with an inability to react. But that actual freeze response, which is a sort of like a playing dead, a switching down, can often actually be quite an effective survival strategy.
And quite often under stress we get really busy trying to solve the problem and it's very unfocused. And in fact the best thing to do sometimes is just to pause and just take stock of the situation. I think that's that freeze response at its best.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, one other thing that was noticed is that when you pay attention to the breath, that it often changes. And of course that happens in quite a natural way. There's no particular need to try and regulate the breathing in say, mindfulness practice on the breath, as you might do, say, with some forms of yoga breathing and so on. But the breathing very often changes as the metabolism drops and the breathing becomes more natural and diaphragmatic. There is very often a change that sort of happens by itself.
Yes.
Some people become very self-conscious about the breathing when meditating on the breath and trying to control it and regulate it, and that attempt to control the breathing sometimes makes people's feeling that the breathing's actually quite laboured and difficult, and to let go of that and just allow the body to breathe, because it certainly knows how to do it. It does it all night without us even trying, is much more helpful.
People who've done a lot of yoga sometimes have trouble just letting the breath happen naturally. And so, that's the intention. Even if we feel like we're controlling it, the intention is just to let it happen naturally as best we can. And also I find often people with a lot of anxiety often worry and obsess about their breathing. Am I breathing deeply enough? Am I doing this right? And for them, again, the intention is just as best they can to let the breath happen naturally. And sometimes it might be better to start by meditating on sounds or something like that rather than the breath, if they're finding they're particularly caught up in that.
Yes. Yeah. Now, one topic that's come up and created a lot of discussion, and I think naturally enough in the modern day, has to do with multitasking. It was very clear from a lot of the discussion that many people felt that didn't even need to do the multitasking experiment because already know what it feels like and that it's not helpful. Others, and I think probably more often for younger people these days that have been brought up with multitasking and on the smartphones the whole time while interacting with the world, is that very often there's quite a lot to discover there, things that have not been noticed about multitasking. But the importance of the experiment is, for those who really wanted to do it, is to actually notice what is the effect, to bring awareness to the experience of multitasking, because we certainly find with a lot of the student groups who work with at university, they discover a lot and didn't actually realise what was really taking place. So it can be a useful experiment to do if not so sure.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course another thing that we mentioned last week was of course having music on, and how some people find that really useful for perhaps getting less distracted in environmental sounds. And a question that came up this week was around doodling. You quite often see people sitting there in class, they look like they're listening, but they're also sort of drawing patterns on their page and that kind of thing. And quite often when I check in with people about that, they tell me that is a way of actually bringing their attention into the present, where if they weren't doing that, maybe they'd be much more lost in default mode and distracted. And somehow that just brings them into the moment enough that they can actually hear what's being said. So while it looks like distraction, I think sometimes it's a strategy that people use to actually be a bit more present.
Yeah, and if that task is a reasonably simple one that's not demanding a lot of attention, the motor memory's there, and and so there can still be reasonable attention going to the task. Ultimately, I dare say it'd be useful to not need that.
That's
and
right.
maybe over time people find that they less need that other thing to actually engage their attention in the moment.
Well, if they're practicing mindfulness and learning to be more engaged without those kinds of tools, just to pay attention and to deal with distractions with mindfulness, I think over time they could maybe turn the music off or stop the doodling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another issue that comes up a lot has to do with self-criticism. Is there any use or value in it? And I think that there is a kind of value in being able to be reflective, to be able to acknowledge an error, a problem, and so on, to actually have a sincere desire to address that. And that's actually associated with better mental health and, learning from experience and so on. There's another kind of self-criticism that happens a lot and becomes very apparent as soon as we start to practice mindfulness. It's the constant internal dialogue, this sort of distraction, internal distraction, criticizing, judging, blaming. That's a whole form of default mode. It tends not to be objective, it tends not to be impartial, it tends not to be very self-compassionate, and is really at the heart of rumination, at the heart of worry, and that's not necessarily helpful at all. And I think it's important to distinguish between which is which, a kind of a discerning, reflective self-evaluation that we can learn from, but this other kind of internal chatter and dialogue which can be completely disengages from ourselves and from our life.
That's right. And that second type of self-criticism that you're talking about actually engages the stress response. We start releasing adrenaline and cortisol, and the amygdala fires up, and so we get all of the same symptoms or problems that we have with the stress response.
Yeah, and then we don't get out of bed, or we don't go somewhere.
That's right.
and we just draw the blinds, stay in our room, and just have an evening with ourselves in our own heads, and that's not necessarily a very helpful thing to do at all.
No.
Although we all know what that feels like.
Definitely, yeah. And another point that came up was, what do we do when other people are the ones distracting us? Quite often people tell me they're working in open plan offices and it's the person next to them chewing loudly or tapping them on the shoulder or wanting to talk to them. And this is quite a common problem, actually. Having somebody who's distracting us. And of course, sometimes the way modern offices are designed, it can quite easily lead to that kind of thing. But I would say that using mindfulness helps us to first of all deal with distraction. I mean, if someone is distracting us, maybe making noise, we might just want to learn to focus on the work that we're doing, just to notice the distraction and let it go and keep coming back.
Trying to block out distractor influence doesn't help. Let it just be there, but be more interested in something else.
Well, the problem there is then we give our attention to the distraction. It's like trying to not think of a pink elephant. If you're trying to not hear that person crunching their chips or whatever it is, that's the attention's very much caught up in that. But to notice that we're listening and then just to come back to our work, I think is a really important thing to do.
I think the other thing too is when somebody comes into the office, say we're working on something, or at home somebody sort of interrupts while we're doing something important, and actually maybe ask the question, is this really urgent now, because I'm just in the flow of something, can I come back to you in 5 minutes on that, and so on.
Yes.
It just helps them to recognise between, is it really urgent and needs attention now, or is it something, oh no, that's fine, I'll come back. So people, I think very often in this sort of pace of modern life, we're not even aware that we're interrupting others, and we're not aware enough of noticing, oh wait a sec, that person's really working on something, I'll come back at a moment when they're maybe they're seem like they're free, and I think that's part of being mindful, is actually noticing how our reactions and interactions with others are maybe distracting them too.
And that multitasking mentality as well can sometimes lead to us trying to focus on our work and half listening to our colleagues, when, as you said, it might be better to say, look, I actually need to do this, can we speak about this, can we make a time? Or can we talk about that later?
Yes. Yeah. It's come up a lot from those at home, particularly from mothers as well, so with young children, and you have to multitask at home. And I think, again, just to really notice what's happening, because, and mind you, I think a challenge for attention being at home with young kids and a lot going on, that raises the bar in terms of being able to be present.
Teachers as well.
Yeah, for teachers. And very often, mothers or teachers will notice that there's a very subtle distinction between being in the flow and efficient and effective, which is actually efficient attention switching, going on and putting on the washing, for example, coming back and tending to something with the child, then checking something on the stove, that's not actually multitasking. That's attending to one thing at a time, but in a fluid and efficient way. That's different to trying to do it all at the same time, because that's when the stress builds up the most.
And the errors and the...
Yeah, so pretending that talking to the child while actually trying to do something else that's complex, and that's a very superficial conversation. It's just, oh yes, 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 and the child knows that, the adult's not paying attention. And so I think it's important, say, child speaking and doing something that's important, to actually make a decision. Is it the child first, or is it doing this? If it's this first, then I'll speak with you in a few minutes. Just let me finish this first, and to go on with that task. If the child really needs attention, it's leave that task and engage fully with the child. And I think that's really the important kind of message of whatever we're doing, do it with attention.
Yes.
And then move on to the next thing.
Yep. Yeah. And following on from that, I really like the question, are women better at multitasking than men? Because of course this is this assumption that a lot of people have. It's and it's just part of that multitasking mythology, and again, if we come back to neurology, to the level of the brain, that we process information in serial, not in parallel. So multitasking is an illusion anyway.
For males and
for
females.
males and for females. Possibly females are better at attention switching. That might be part of it, just for evolutionary reasons, but certainly...
Some have said there's a bigger bridge between the right and left hemispheres, the corpus callosum, maybe switch information a bit more quickly, but that's not multitasking. No. That's more efficient attention switching.
That's right. And again, nobody can multitask. It's an illusion.
Yes. So just in terms of procrastination as well, and getting caught in that sort of cycle of rumination, that's a topic that comes up for a lot of people as well. Yeah.
Yes, somebody asked about waking up in the morning, lying in bed, catastrophizing and starting the day with anxiety and that kind of thing, and not being particularly motivated to get up and meditate. And of course, that's, I think that's a way that a lot of us at times start the day, lying there thinking about all the things we have to do, all the problems that we have, and it's not a particularly good way to start the day. Really.
It's a form of meditation in itself. It's almost like wake up and I'll fit in a quick 20 minutes of rumination. It's like the rumination. Yeah. And I go to the shower and I'll fit in a quick little 5 minutes then. And oftentimes we wake up at 3 in the morning and don't need to be up until 6. We fit in a full 3 hours of negative self-talk and so on. And I guess we've got to make a decision to actually notice what's happening in a non-judgmental way, because this is a natural thing, it happens very commonly.
Notice that we're doing that.
Notice we're doing it, but to make a choice, wait a sec, look, do I need to practice this for another 20 minutes and so on? No, maybe I need to find something to engage my attention with. Yeah. That means get out of bed and just do something. And it doesn't matter how mundane it is, but to engage with that can be a good way to sort of cut through that sort of repetitive cycle.
That mindfulness of everyday activities, just making a cup of tea or having a shower and really paying attention to the experience of it.
Yeah. One other thing about stage fright comes up, and I think there's a lot of people who could relate to that. And it's very interesting to notice where almost like on a micro level, where the attention goes then. Because very often in the lead up to speaking in public, say, the mind's already thinking and anticipating. So to come back to the present moment, with what we're doing, the tea we're drinking, the person we're with. So it can be helpful, but the mind keeps diving into, how's it going to go? I hope it goes well, hope it doesn't go badly. And to sort of, in a sense, put all that hopeful thinking aside, come back and engage. But even in the moment of, say, being introduced, is the attention on the person who's speaking and introducing us, or is the attention very subtly in the background? Oh no, I'm about to go up. Oh no, how's it going to go? And the mind's just launching into what might or might not happen in 5 or 10 seconds from now. And that's a very challenging thing. And very often we think, I'm practicing mindfulness, I'm practicing acceptance, I'm practicing not judging, I'm practicing all of this, but it's still there. And actually what's happening is there's a veneer of acceptance, there's a veneer of not judging laid over the top of a whole lot of non-acceptance and a whole lot of judging. Like we're using mindfulness to make those thoughts and feelings go away. And what we're actually doing is reinforcing them very often. So to actually be comfortable, to actually be accepting of an uncomfortable thought or feeling means exactly that. And it's not an attempt to make it go away. Now, it may change, but it's not an attempt to make it go away. It's an attempt in a sense, it's a practice of feeling comfortable, but just to gently re-engage for the attention, for example, with the person's voice who's introducing us, to engage the attention with the people in the audience, to actually look at the person, to actually look at what's there. So the feeling of the feet as they're going up the steps onto the dais, for example, when about to present.
Breathing's good too.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's a practice. It's just an ongoing practice. The mind will keep getting hooked up into that, and of course it's just noticing and coming back to the feet, the breath, whatever's happening in the moment over and over again, right?
Yes, and because very often we do, with the best will in the world, feel like we're trying to practice mindfulness when we're actually, there's that veneer of mindfulness over the top of a whole lot of non-acceptance and judging.
Yeah. Finally, someone asked, is meditating a form of self-hypnosis? And then went on to ask about why we need to meditate. And in my experience with hypnosis, it's a type of attentional focus, but one where we don't really bring the attention to anything in particular. With hypnosis, we just let the mind kind of wander wherever it wants to go, and at times there can be a sort of a sense of separation and distance from our experience. Whereas mindfulness is much more about directing the attention to where we want it, to whatever's happening in the present moment, and rather than being a sort of a distance, there's actually a sense of greater engagement.
And generally not using any kind of visualization, but in a sense cutting through the visualization to more fully visualize what's actually in front of us in the present moment.
Yes, to see more clearly. And also this person asked, well, why do we need to meditate? It's much quicker to simply adopt a mindful lifestyle. Which is a good point. I mean, of course, that's really the ultimate point of mindfulness, is to be more present and engaged in each moment, to more fully taste the food that we're eating and engage with the conversation we're having and notice what we can see and feel from moment to moment. But I think that the meditation is therefore just a small part of that, but it's a very important part. In some ways quite fundamental to mindfulness, because of course there are so many factors at play that distract us and take us out of the moment, and the frantic hyperkinetic pace of modern life and digital technology and all of these things are working against mindfulness. So having a practice and a way of actually retraining ourselves to be present, rewiring the brain, of course, with that massed practice, that's really at the foundation of being able to then be more present and engaged in each moment, wouldn't you say?
Yes, and it's not like we have to do something that we don't want to do, but I do think the formal practice is a little bit like, if we wanted to get fitter and stronger, then we could take the stairs more often at work, we could lift the shopping, walk with the bags without the trolley, we could, do those sort of informal exercises and activities, and we would get some strength and fitness from that. But if you said to somebody, well, no, I really want to build it up, you'd say spend some time in the gym, or spend some time on the running track. And in a way, the formal meditation practice is like the concentrated time in the gym or on the running track, and you get a lot of value from that over and above the informal practice. So yes, it can be developed in both ways, but it's not always apparent to us initially, well, why sitting here and practicing this? But it's, in a sense, there's a lot more to notice. It's a lot more revealing, and we certainly, it's every person's own choice, but we certainly do encourage it, and to get the formal practice, because it is the gym work.
It's also laboratory conditions, because we can sit there and we can really start to notice what's happening in the mind and what's happening in the body and what's happening around us, and it removes some of the distractions so that we can really start to notice with much greater clarity what's actually going on moment to moment, which can be a very useful thing. So thank you very much. We hope you've gotten something out of this weekly debrief. We look forward to chatting again next week. And we're just so heartened and encouraged to see so many good questions and so many encouraging comments, and the way that one of the things that really came out was this sort of sense of a community of learning, and that's fantastic, that the more you engage with the program, the more you feel like you're connecting with people who've got a like mind and like heart right around the world. So please keep the conversation happening.